Okay, good afternoon to all. Benvenuti a tutti. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome you all here for the distinguished lecture of the Academy of European Law. And as I think everybody knows here, the Academy this year has been focused on the work and career of Bruno De Vita. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome as our distinguished lecturer this year, Professor Marta Cartabia. And I was thinking as I was preparing to introduce Marta that it would be difficult to think of someone more deserving of the title of distinguished lecturer. She will shake her head now as I say this, but that's all the more reason. It's hard to think of someone who's had a career that is so distinguished along so many dimensions as Professor Cartabia. And perhaps the most important of those is having been the supervisee of Professor Bruno De Vita here at the EUI. But she has a number of other accomplishments also to her name, even if they don't quite rival that come close. Professor Cartabia began her studies at the University of Milan and chose very wisely then, as perhaps not so many Italian students would have in those days, to do her PhD at this interesting, unique institute here at the European University Institute, where she studied, wrote on the fundamentals of European law with Bruno. And after that, Marta went on to build a really successful career as professor of constitutional law initially at Milan Bicocca, and was appointed at a really very early age, if I might say, to the Italian Constitutional Court, where she spent a decade on the court, including as vice president and ultimately as president of the court. And during that time, even while on the court, but certainly before and after it, Marta has also maintained a really distinguished career as a scholar of Italian constitutional law, European law, European Union, and ECHR law and human rights. I would say as a scholar of multi-level public law and national, European, and global constitutional and public law. And she has published extensively in the field, including in recent years 2 books in the last, I would say, 2 years on Italian constitutional law and constitutional dialogues. But after her tenure on the Constitutional Court, as everybody knows, Marta was appointed Minister for Justice, where she undertook important reforms to the Italian judicial system. And you would think after that, a career in public service and maintaining dual careers as well as a very busy family life, that would be enough. But Marta has re-engaged fully since stepping down as Minister for Justice and is currently co-editor-in-chief of no less than 2 leading Italian journals. She was co-founder and is co-editor of the Italian Journal of Public Law. She's co-editor-in-chief of Quaderni Costituzionali. And none of the things that Marta does, by the way, are ever done just as a formality or as a titular appointment. She engages fully with everything that she does. And so these are, substantive editorial positions. And as if that were not enough, she's also co-president of the the International Society for Public Law, ICON-S, as it's known, and is about to take a short journey tomorrow to New Zealand to preside over the annual meeting of that society. In addition, to all of these, she's a substitute member for Italy on the Venice Commission of Democracy Through Law, so maintaining her role as a public servant and undertaking these really important roles at a time of, as we know, rising authoritarianism around the world and in Europe too. But I think it would be remiss, I think normally in these kinds of introductions of very distinguished people like Marta, it's unusual to focus also on the more personal dimension, but Marta is also, in addition to having really accomplished more in that career to date, and she has many decades ahead of her in her career, that she's also been a wonderful colleague, a mentor, a teacher, and really all round a wonderful person. She's visited widely at many institutions in Europe, in the United States, and I first came to know her at New York University in 2010 when she spent a year there. And what's always struck me about Marta when she comes is that she engages with the same degree of interest and genuine enthusiasm with the students who are just beginning their studies and the most distinguished of visitors or speakers. And so she's has maintained a real humility, I think, throughout her career, and an interest and a lack of pretension. In addition to being as distinguished as she is along all of these dimensions, she has also remained a really warm and wonderful human being. So I'm delighted to hand over, and I've called her Marta, I apologize for my informality, to Professor Cartabia for her distinguished lecture. Marta, the floor is yours.
Gronia, thank you. I was tempted to stop you because here today we are here to celebrate Bruno and his family, not me, and I'm here just in my capacity of a former supervisee of Bruno De Vite, which is the best part of all the wonderful things that so generously Gronia said about me. Great teacher, great person, great celebration. Somehow it's very paradoxical because I've never met such a discreet leader as Bruno is. The most discreet person, but also a strong leader that leave a mark in the life of the people that met him, as they are so lucky enough to meet him in their life. So this lecture, Bruno, is dedicated to you, and with a lot of I'm really grateful for all the things that I learned from you. And I will elaborate a little bit on a topic that has been at the center of my research, but that we have also in some way in common. You have covered a broad range of topics in European law. Among this broad range of topics, there is also the role of courts. It's something that you have analyzed times and again, and I think it's back to an important, at the center of the stage in a different way from the one that I addressed when I was here as a student, a PhD student. But so, I would like to elaborate a little bit. I try to elaborate a title for this lecture, and tentatively it will be The Emergence of European Constitutional Democracy and the Role of National Constitutional Courts. And I would like to suggest that the rule of law crisis that has affected the EU for some years already, starting with Poland and Hungary, is producing an unintended positive side effect, which is a new reflection on the importance of building a community of values in Europe, or if you prefer, a society of values, as Article 2 of the Union Treaty says, and some scholars are already inquiring into. And to this purpose, to the purpose of building a community of values, a strong, independent judiciary, both at national and the community level, is essential. So, the role of national court in the shaping of a European constitutional order. This is an evergreen topic in the EU law studies, because the development of a European constitutional law has been and is still a process, and even a very long one. Unlike what happened in most national constitutions, the European constitutional order has not been enacted in one particular moment in time by an authoritative constitutional assembly, but has been developed in a piecemeal fashion since the origin. I would say, on the contrary, when there was the constitutional momentum à la fin du siècle, and we tried to give the EU a constitution, the treaty establishing a European constitution, that project failed. And yet the process of development of a constitutional order in the EU never stopped. In this process, courts have played a major role. Both the European Court and the National Constitutional Court, and most important, both of them in dialogues. Let me indulge for one moment again in some memories that come to my mind in this place, thinking back to the time of my PhD at the Institute. It was the end of the 80s, although I participated to the ceremony of the conferral of the PhD just 2 years ago as a Minister of Justice, but still. I am a constitutional scholar entrenched in the Italian tradition, and yet I owe to the Institute and to my supervisor in particular the intuition to give my research in constitutional law a European twist, or if you prefer, to give my research some breadth and to put it in a broader perspective with a European dimension. For my PhD dissertation, I took a traditional topic of constitutional law. It was about the eternity clauses of the Constitution, or if you want to say in more appealing and updated language, the unamendable constitutional clauses or unconstitutional constitutional amendments, as Yaniv Rosnay and Richard Albert, for example, among many others say. But following the suggestion of Bruno, I put it in a European perspective, and the result of this research was a contribution to the counter limits doctrine of the Italian Constitutional Court that was already in a nutshell in the case law of the Constitutional Court, but then later developed so much. A doctrine that under different names is very well known and practiced by other courts. Identity review or ultra-vires or similar labels are used by Constitutional Court, unfortunately not always in a constructive way, as we have all seen in the past few years. Eventually, the idea of the national identities as part of the constitutional structure of the EU was even introduced in the text of the treaty under the 4.2 clause. I was attracted by that topic because I thought, and I still think, that it captures a fundamental trait of the EU constitutional order, made of pluralism, multiple identities, always in a balance between two poles, unity, diversity, an ever closer union that never extinguishes the identity of its component. At that epoch, the idea of constitutional pluralism as a trademark of the European Union was at the center of many conversations, workshops, conferences, here, especially here at the EUI, and the doctrine of counter limits and identity review was a component, and not a minor one, of this discussion. The central point of my thesis was that in case of conflicts between EU law and national fundamental constitutional principles, the way out should be found in a dialogical attitude of the courts. On this point, I think that Bruno has expressed a skeptical view, in a way, and he helped me in the past few days to find a piece of one of his contribution, the title of which is "The Closest Thing to a Constitutional Conversation in Europe, the Semi-Permanent Treaty Revision Process," back to 2002, where he said that come on, courts cannot really engage in a proper conversation. To be sure, he said that when referred to judicial conversation, the metaphorical capacity of the term dialogue is stretched very far. Can I read some lines of this contribution? He says, this is his voice, "The members of these courts hardly know each other and certainly never sit together formally to examine a particular case or abstract question. One may call the preliminary rulings mechanism a system of court-to-court dialogue, but one should not forget that preliminary references emanate from ordinary national courts and not, or very seldom, from constitutional courts. Moreover, these preliminary references are hardly ever formulated as queries about constitutional matters, even though the European Court of Justice has occasionally sent a constitutional message back. Furthermore, the European Court of Justice has never in its judgment referred to a judgment or a doctrine of a national constitutional court, not even when the European Court extracts general principles of easy law from the common constitutional traditions of the member states. The national courts, from their side, do refer extensively to judgment of the European Court, but their options are essentially restricted either to accepting the positions defined by the European Court or else to replacing to the European diktat by a national counter-diktat. A real dialogue with mutual exchange of arguments requires a series of subsequent references in different cases raising similar problems, which is rather cumbersome and rarely happens. And he went on saying that the political spaces are more suitable for a conversation, especially constitutional conversations. At that time, I think he wanted to suggest that the building of a constitutional order in Europe should not be left only in the hands, on the shoulders of courts, but we needed political institutions to engage on this common enterprise. And I fully agree with this perspective. I'm curious to know whether he has the same opinion today about judicial conversation and the like, maybe later. But yet many things have happened in the past 20 years since he wrote this article, and the relationship between the European Court of Justice and national constitutional courts have also changed a lot on both sides. In any case, I still think that national constitutional courts are important actors of the making of a European constitutional order. A constructive use of the doctrine of national constitutional identities have prompted the European Court of Justice to develop a veritable constitutional case law, first on fundamental rights and more recently on other constitutional principles, the balance of power, the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, for example. Anyway, Bruno's scholarship has continued to reason on the role of national courts in the making of a European constitutional order. He has written times and again. One of the most recent contributions on this topic is an article co-authored with Monica Claes, an authority in this field, who has written widely on this topic. And they say that national courts in the European panorama plays three different roles. One is that they facilitate the reception of EU law and also of the European Convention of Human Rights in the domestic legal system. Second, Constitutional and Supreme Court have engaged with the European courts in developing common constitutional heritage of Europe in a process of give and take in cooperation with one another. And third, occasionally, they express the Constitutional Court their readiness to defend the national constitution and state sovereignty against the incoming tide of European law. I think that this piece summarizes very well the role played by national constitutional courts in the European constitutional space so far. I would like just to make a footnote. There are some readings, one among many others, Joseph Weiler with Lustig in 2018, published in Icon, showing that there are three waves, as if there is a chronological development. First, the Constitutional Court protect their national principles, then they open up to the international, and a more recent wave, court reassert the primacy of the Constitution over international law. I don't know. I'm not sure that we can read the attitude of National Constitutional Court in this chronological sequence. I think that there are so many contradictions and so many different cases, so many different reactions, that we can only say that the three roles are present all together in all the Constitutional Court, depending on the case, on the composition of the court, on the moment, on many different things. So I fully agree with their understanding of these different attitudes, but I don't think that we can really say we have we entered a new era of the attitude of the national courts towards Europe, or in another way, we have some more nationalistic courts and other more pro-European. It depends. It depends on the cases and on many different situations. So this topic is the traditional topic and is still very relevant, but it is also well explored. I think that something has happened in the recent times that is changing the setting. And I refer indeed to the rule of law crisis. In my view, it is reshaping the debate. I think that the attacks to Supreme and Constitutional Courts in some member states, Hungary, Poland, are making the European institutions, including the European Court of Justice, more aware of the importance of national constitutional court as partners rather than enemies, counterparts, obstacles for the construction and the maintenance of a European constitutional order and democracy. It's time for rebuilding a mutual trust, even among courts. I would like to elaborate a little bit on this idea that, in my view, is a side effect of the rule of law crisis, shedding new light on the importance of national constitutional courts in the European constitutional space. First of all, let's give a name to the rule of law crisis. This crisis has not been caused by the decisions of some constitutional courts that occasionally have contradicted the European Court of Justice in order to defend the national values. The crisis has exploded when some national constitutional courts have been attacked by their own governments, and their independence was put at risk, and their role of neutral guardian of higher constitutional values was damaged. In a way, the crisis was caused not by strong courts resisting to the European Court of Justice, but by weakening the national constitutional courts. To be sure, this is not a special offer of the day of Europe. Unfortunately, this idea of attacking courts is going viral. And I think that one of the most worrisome crises is in the air, especially in the judicial reform in Israel. If we look at that reform in Israel, we see that there are two major points that are paradigmatic of the risks to which constitutional courts, or courts that play the role of constitutional adjudication. In Israel, it's a Supreme Court, but I say constitutional court because of their role. It's paradigmatic of what can happen to courts. One point is about the selection of judges, and the second one is about their competencies. About the selection of judges, in Israel, the selection of all judges is in the mission of a special selecting committee. This committee has a mixed composition. The reform, it's made of 9 people, proposed to substitute the 2 members of the Bar Association with 2 political members, and it changes everything because the balance between the political and the professional is impaired, and the majority, 5 out of 9 of these members, will be the expression of the political majority, if the reform is approved, of the majority in government. The second point concerns the powers of the Supreme Court, especially in the field of judicial review of legislation. First of all, there are 3 major changes. One is that in order to declare the unconstitutionality of a piece of legislation, the judges of the Supreme Court, it will require the majority of 12 out of 15 of the judges of the Supreme Court. So a high qualified majority for declaring unconstitutionality. Second, there are some laws, the basic laws that refers to some special feature of the Israeli constitution that are not subject to judicial review, but by the way, basic laws are approved as any other law. It's just named basic law by the parliament, by the Knesset. Third, there is an override clause allowing the parliament to consider the legislation declared invalid by the Constitutional Court, notwithstanding applicable in the legal system. So really there is a downplaying of the powers of the court in judicial review of legislation. This is emblematic of the 2 different set of problems that courts are facing around the world. The first one, we can call it capturing the court or packing the court, very clear in Poland and Hungary when the political majority controls the majority of the judges in a court. And the second one is taming the court or curbing the powers of the court. I would like to go a little bit deeper into these 2 problems. Capturing the court, the politicization, how do you say it? It's correct, it's difficult, of the court damages the authority of the court from the root. Stephen Breyer, in a small book, it was a lecture that he pronounced in the memory of Justice Scalia, says, if the public views judges as politicians in robes, whatever color of the robe, their confidence in the court and the rule of law itself will only weaken, thereby weakening the power of the court, including its power to check and balance other departments. It is true. That's the higher risk for a court. A court perceived as deciding along party political lines, or worse, as a political instrument of the government or the opposition, ceases to be a court. The authority of the court stands in their neutrality, in their independence, in their equidistance from the political parties. If they are not, there are two options. Either they become a political branch of the executive and they act as loyal servants, rubber stamping the government's agenda, always supporting the line of the government, or on the contrary, if they become a political branch of the opposition, they systematically obstruct the political action of the majority or undo whatever the political bodies try to do. Do you remember the Lochner era of the US Supreme Court? Constitutional courts are fatally damaged if they become partisan. Their neutrality is impaired. And so how to prevent the politicization, correct me please, of the court? In my view, there are three central issues in order to prevent the politicization of the court. The first one is how to select judges, and I will come in a minute on this point, the central one. Second question, how long do they stay in office? And is their term renewable? Comparative law and comparative experiences show that a reasonably long term, 9, 12 years, has proved to be good. It's not too rigid, but long enough to be not on the same line of the political election. So the judges are not renewed as at the same time of the renewal of the political bodies. But in my view, there is one point, a very serious one. Renewable terms for judges is not a good thing, is never a good thing for any kind of court. There is a third point that is under consideration in some courts. I learned this from Matthias, who is doing a wonderful research on this issue. The cooling off period for members of the court that has covered a political role, cooling off period in advance and even after the term of mandate could help keeping some distance from the court and the political, the partisan, the life of the political institutions. But the central issue is the appointment of a selection of judges. Let me draw your attention on a point that I learned as a member of the Venice Commission. Ukraine, they are in the middle of a war, under the bombs, and yet the Verkhovna Rada, their parliament, is working at a reform of the Constitutional Court. Impressive. This was required by the European Commission that made a number of points requesting a number of reforms in order to allow Ukraine to become a candidate for the accession to the European Union. One of the points that has been at the center of debates that are in place since, I would say, 6 months at least, even more, between the Venice Commission, the European Commission, and the National Authority in Ukraine is the appointment system of judges. There are 3 appointing bodies, the President, the Parliament, and the Congress of Judges, but the European Commission has insisted on putting a sort of vetting group similar to the 255 body that has been introduced for the judges of the European Union. and with an important role played by international actors. Whatever is the solution that we found, what is interesting is that among many different things that you can ask to a country like Ukraine before becoming candidate, a serious point is on the selection, the procedure of selection of constitutional judges. It should be perceived as a relevant point, otherwise you do not insist on having a big change in the country on this point, in this specific moment in the middle of a war. And I think that a mixed composition similar to the Italian Constitutional Court with different bodies appointing a quota of the judges. In Italy, for example, we have 5 by the President of the Republic, 5 by the Parliament with a qualified majority, and 5 elected by the highest judiciary, is a good solution because it's more difficult to imagine that a single political party captures the majority of the judges. And also, I like this solution for another reason. We want judges, we want courts to be neutral. But I learned from one of my sons, who is a painter, he studied Beaux-Arts at Brera, that we have 2 neutral colors. Black is a neutral color and white is a neutral color. But there is a big difference between the 2 of them. Black is neutral because of the lack of light and colors. White is neutral because it incorporates all the colors of the spectrum. So you can reach neutrality with a minus or with a plus, by deduction or by a sum. And I think that for a court is much more interesting to reach a neutrality or to approach neutrality, because another thing that he told me is that neutral color are not available in nature. We approach this neutrality, but it's never pure neutrality. You don't have pure black or pure white. But white is brighter, is more rich. It reflects that kind of pluralism of point of view that we want in a court. Plural from many different points of view, from the gender, coming from different regions, different generations as well, different cultural background. This is a rich court that approaches a neutral body better than an hypothetical neutral court that does not know any kind of identity of these judges. On this point, there are some courts that are more vulnerable than the Italian one. I just come back from Germany. There is a big debate around the strong, important Bundesverfassungsgericht. One of the points for which the court is attacked is for the kind of composition. 8 plus 8, elected by the 2 branches of the parliament with simple majority. This is not an easy position, and there are some new parties that are contesting the composition of the court. This is for, capturing the court. We had the other problem, taming the. Are we going too long? Tell me how much? Okay. Thank you. Are you tired? If I'm boring, please let me know. I can skip some parts. But when I speak about Constitutional Court, I get passionate again. Even though I'm no longer on the Constitutional Court for years, but anyway. So the Israeli reform shows that there is another risk, which is reducing the powers of the court. It is true that the single proposals of that reform are not unprecedented. We know in the comparative panorama that there are some weak judicial review systems, especially in the Commonwealth system. Canada knows an overriding clause or notwithstanding clause, but also other countries. But the combination of all these proposals in the Israeli court is really damaging the possibility itself of having a meaningful review of legislation. And here I think that us, the scholars, the constitutional scholars, have some responsibility. Do you remember the counter-majoritarian difficulty by John Hart Ely, 80s? More recently, the praise of political constitutionalism, Jeremy Waldron, or the warning against the risk of juristocracy by Ron Hirschel, or even stronger, the case against constitutionalism by Martin Laughlin, 2022. It has become a common objection that 5, 8, 10, 15 persons who face no political responsibility can thwart political projects that have been key to the winning of political platforms. Nothing new under the sun. At the origin of the judicial review of legislation in Europe, there was a big debate triggered by another book, Edouard Lambert, Le Gouvernement des Juges. He was worried about conservative courts that would hinder the social reforms. Again, we are back to the Lochner era. And this book was very influential. We have traces of this book also in the debates, for example, of the Constituent Assembly in Italy. Now people are concerned for the opposite reason. They are more concerned with courts that are too progressive rather than too conservative, but the argument is the same. Partisan courts. Let me reply to this question with a couple of sentences written by David Kretzmer about the Israeli reform. And he says, "It must be admitted that some of the criticism against the court is not baseless. The court has ruled on some political matters that do not involve direct violation of individual rights, and that should have been left to the political arena." He refers here to the question of the ultra-Orthodox community and the duty to serve in the army. But he concludes, despite the criticism of the court, it is clear that the solution should not be weakening the court's power or competence. In fact, in a way, he admits that in more than one case, the court has overstepped the border between the constitutional and the political, a debate that is always there in courts. The president of the Italian Constitutional Court is very well aware about that. It's a debate that is also in our country. But the reform in Israel is an overreaction by the part of the political majority. It is as if somebody got a flu and you want to kill the person in order to take away the fever. The reform almost kills the Supreme Court. And we have to be aware of this overreaction. And in order to be aware of this risk, I think that we have to take very seriously the criticism about the risk of courts stepping into the political domain. In my view, the problem that causes some overreactions that might bring to the crisis of the rule of law, as we have seen in Poland and in Hungary, now in Israel, and maybe in other countries, is the evergreen problem of the respect of the balance of powers, the constitutional balance of powers between, especially along the line between the political and the judicial, the democratic and the constitutional, the gubernaculum and the jurisdictio. The courts shall not overstep the domain of politics, because the politics shall do its job. But to be sure, we are at this point because the judicial system, and more specifically, Supreme Courts and constitutional courts, have been overburdened with too many tasks, with too many functions, and too many expectations as well. Too often the judiciary has been called to play the role of a substitute for weak politics that avoid and can avoid sensitive, tough, and divisive issues. The judicial power today is no longer the mute, null power of the 19th century, is not the void power of Montesquieu or the least dangerous branch described by Hamilton. Mauro Cappelletti, a big professor here, your teacher, right, wrote already in the 70s about the rise of the judiciary around the world. Many, many highly political and controversial cases have been brought in front of courts, and there has been so many political issues that has been shaped in judicial and legal terms. And courts, unlike the political bodies, cannot decide to set them aside. When a case is brought in front of the courts have to decide. For example, years ago in the Italian Constitutional Court was very much criticized because it took an important decision about the electoral legislation, something that now is at the center of the debate in the US. Indeed, the court took a decision, an important decision on a highly political matters as the, electoral formula that you have to use in order to elect the parliament. But what could have done in that case the court? And the court cannot say, I don't want to decide. The parliament, if the case was brought in front of the court, it was because everybody was complaining about that electoral law, but nobody has the courage to change it in the political venues. So, in my view, it is true that we are in a difficult situation, but also because courts are called into a number of issues that are very difficult, even political questions that are brought in front of the court in legal terms. And this brings the court under the spotlight indeed, but make no mistake, saying that the court has to step in these difficult political issues does not mean that they are partisan. Partisanship is not equivalent to political role. Anyway, I think that we have to take seriously these kind of complaints and risk in order to prevent major overreaction and to think about a better divide between the domain of justice and the domain of politics, or if you want, the domain of the constitutional and the domain of the political. And also to think about a better cooperation between courts and political institutions. The reply to the risk of overstepping the border of the political is not the sterilization of constitutional courts or the politicization of the courts or killing the courts. We need a better balance. And there are so many possibility to think about that. A young Italian professor, Michele Massa, has just written a nice book on judicial minimalism. It is an interesting overview of the American academic debate on the limits that courts should not respect. For example, For example, he recalls Cass Sunstein when he says, decide one case at a time. You don't need to expound big principles and big justification or reasoning. One case at a time. Or another possibility, Guido Calabresi, avoid the temptation of the big decision. Or another one, elaborate modalities of decision that give leeway to the political bodies. I very much appreciated the decision of the Constitutional Court in a very difficult case, the Italian one, on the end-of-life issues, very sensitive, to take a new technique of decision saying, we are going to say that this law is unconstitutional, but we hold on for 1 year. We give the possibility to the parliament to decide differently, to regulate the matters. It's something that is not only Italian, it's made by the Canadian court and other, the UK and Austria, especially on this kind of issues. So we can have a huge number of possibilities to think about involving political institutions to take their responsibility in their own fields without stepping back, without withdrawing from the responsibility of courts. Another reflection on this point, but I'm going too long, is the book by Rosalind Dixon about responsive judicial review, which is exactly in this same vein. Let's go back to conclude to Europe and to the European context. We have these courts under attack both by capturing the court or curbing the court's power. But this debate is no longer Poland and Hungary. German Constitutional Court is under attack for the composition, as I said, but also for other reasons. For example, because the court has a limited access to a number of journalists rather than be open to everybody, or for the dinner between judges and the members of the government, and they had protesters in front of the court in Karlsruhe for the decision taken in on the emergency legislation during the pandemic. France, a lot of criticism for the decision of April 14 on the use of 49.3 clause about the approval of the pension reform. So also well-established court can shake. Maybe they have a stronger tradition, they resist longer, but the risk is also for them. What are these effects of the court's crisis that affect the countries of the Union? I make 3 final short points. In my view, Poland and Hungary has made clear that the European project needs strong and independent national constitutional courts. Strong national constitutional courts are not a threat for the European constitutional project, as some thought during the national identity debate. They are fundamental pillars of the plural European constitutional common space. And the European Court of Justice has acknowledged this, starting with the decision of 2018 on Portugal, for example, calling for using arguments that rely on Article 2, 49 of the Charter, and so on, 47 of the Charter and 19 of the Treaty. And we can see that the European Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Justice, and other international institutions are closing their ranks in order to support the independence of judiciary in national member states. Second, and this is paradoxical, but in my view it's true, the rule of law crisis is reinforcing the constitutional dimension of the European Union. We understand that we cannot do without a community of values, of constitutional common values. And we understand that if the national constitutional environment gets sick in one country, all the union suffers. And a number of countermeasures have been taken in order to counter this risk. We all know the usual and unusual suspect in the reaction to the another wonderful piece by Bruno De Vite on the reaction about the rule of law, the reports of the Commission on the rule of law and the monetary system, the role of the courts, the conditionality regulation, and also let's pay attention to the proposal of reform of the Court of Justice of the European Union. There are two different views. The parliaments want a system of selection of the cases. The Court of Justice want to get rid of a number of preliminary rulings, but the purpose is the same. They want to keep a stronger court that plays the role of a constitutional court, more space for the development of common constitutional issues. Third and final point, I think that the rule of law crisis has triggered everywhere again anew a debate on what is a democracy, on the idea of democracy. And because it shows that, I'm speaking in front of distinguished people like Yves Menier and many others, sorry for these really trivial remarks, but sometimes we have to restate the obvious. Democracy is not only the rule of the majority, but include a constitutional dimension. A constitutional adjudication is part and parcel of the idea of democracy, at least European style. This is really obvious notions, but in those years where there are so many people speaking against constitutionalism, I think that we have to go back to our history, to the lessons learned from history, where when we knew that majority can do wrong and badly wrong, after World War II, it was clear that we had to secure some principles and values in a higher law. And we still do that. Now we all care a lot about environment in order to counter the climate change and also to future generation. It's interesting that so many countries, including my own country, last year changed the constitution in order to put that value into the text of the constitution. What does it mean? Does it change anything? Nothing? It has a meaning to put it in a higher law. Our contemporary democracies are not majoritarian democracies, they are constitutional democracy where we have a domain of the politics and a domain of the constitutional. If this is true, constitutional adjudication is part and parcel of the notion of democracy. Constitutional adjudication is the contribution that the 20th century gave to a rich notion of democracy. Constitutional democracy is a reply to the disaster of the first part of the 20th century. No power shall be absolute, not even the majority, the power of the majority. And I think that in the end, the rule of law crisis is bringing about these beneficial effects because in front of the rule of law, in some member states, the European institution that used to have some conflictual relationship with national constitutional court react and stand up in defense of robust judiciary in the member states. We are going deeper and rediscovering that an idea of democracy in Europe is a democracy of common values where higher values are equally developed by the political and the judicial institution. In a nutshell, all this fuss, all these crises, all these conflicts are rendering clearer and clearer that an authentic democracy space in Europe is constitutional and pluralistic. And in this contrast, in this construction of this democratic space, a role is for national and supranational court alike. Thank you so much.
I think it's obvious from the applause that they didn't fall asleep, Marta. So we have about 25 minutes remaining, and I'd like to particularly encourage Bruno or the Academy students, those attending the EU Academy, to ask questions. And maybe while I wait for someone to raise their hand, I might just start the ball rolling with a comment to Marta on her talk, and I hope that others will join then the conversation and put up your hand if you have a question. So Marta, you started your talk by saying that you wondered if Joseph's and Doreen's analysis of the three waves was actually right, and you said, well, this third wave of anti-internationalism was less of a problem, and that really the problem is lack of independence of courts and the sort of attempt to politically subdue courts. And I found myself wondering as you spoke then whether actually these things are a bit closer together than you suggested, because it strikes me that when you were diagnosing the reasons for the increasing control over constitutional courts, the move to control them, you talked about them slightly overdoing it in progressive or conservative terms, or overstepping a little. Whereas it strikes me, especially the examples you gave of Poland, Hungary, Israel, there's something much bigger going on there, which is to do with, I think, the rise of a kind of a nationalist, populist, anti-international move that we see really on the rise everywhere, not just or not everywhere, but in many parts of the world, in many countries in Europe too. And that desire to control courts is part of a general desire to control independent institutions that might limit the nationalist, populist, the government that will speak for the people and that resists these. So that it's almost a bigger and deeper problem than slightly curtailing, reminding the National Constitutional Court to stick to its role as an independent institution. Many of these political systems, these governments, don't seem to want that independent, institution. I would love to think the way you ended on the whole "we believe in building these values" and so on, that was widely shared. But I think there's an equal kind of threat and an equally, I won't say widely shared, but a certainly shared attempt to present a different vision of politics and a different role for courts, which is very much a subordinate one. But I want to go back and see, I still don't see any hands raised. Bruno, exactly. I see Bruno, and then I see someone from the Academy who we'll call on second.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marta, for your speech. I have a very specific question. And you said the constitutional courts in countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania maybe, are victims themselves of the rule of law crisis. But having been victims and having been captured to some extent by the government, they become actors themselves now in this rule of law crisis. And being actors, one of the things they've done, and most clearly I think the Polish Constitutional Court, is to say, you know, the Court of Justice is rubbish. You know, what they've done on independence of judge, it's way beyond the limits of their powers. We're not accepting this. Our constitution prevails. So very strong statements. And as a reaction to that, we now see for the first time the European Commission bringing an infringement action against the member state, Poland, for what its constitutional court has been saying. That has never happened in those terms. It's happened with Germany, but then it was immediately solved, so to speak. But now we have this case, you know. The Commission saying Poland is in breach of its obligations under EU law because of what its constitutional court has said. What do you think of that? Was it wise of the European Commission to bring such a case basically against the constitutional court of a member state? And secondly, what would you advise the Court of Justice to decide in a case like this?
Marta, would you like to answer that, or should I gather more questions? More questions. So there's also someone down towards the back, yeah.
Yeah. Hello, thank you. I mean, I was intrigued when you mentioned the Lochner and the gouvernement de juge problem, because I think that, you know, that constellation of problems somehow puts to the fore the fact that this cleavage which you might have and this institutional dysfunctionality may play out not at the level of a cleavage between political institutions and judicial institutions, but perhaps more broadly in terms of the social values and social interests in a way which are represented in a way in judicial institutions. And I am wondering to what extent, I mean, my thinking about it is that maybe there is just so much that formal mechanisms can do in order to ensure that courts are not disembedded from the broader political and social context in which they are called upon to make those difficult political, as you were rightly mentioning, decisions. And I am wondering what your take on this might be, because I think that we may be going down a dangerous way in some respects, especially when it comes to the environmental crisis, which you were also mentioning, because I think that there is something which is starting to go, you know, wrong in terms of the interaction between institutional and extra-institutional politics, which may, on the one hand, lead to a renewed pressure being placed on the judiciary, and we are seeing that through climate litigation. But I am wondering to what extent this may also be problematic, to the extent that courts may be, in turn, part of this dysfunctional relationship we may have between institutions and society at large. So I was wondering what your take on this would be. Thank you.
Any other questions? So I see Professor Walker, Neil in the front. I'm also just going to encourage the Academy students again, if you want to. This is your distinguished lecture, if you have a question.
Okay, sorry, I'm not an Academy student. Marta, you were studiedly neutral when you talked about Bruno's work 20, 30 years ago, his skepticism about dialogue. And I understand you don't want to criticize your ex-supervisor. But it wasn't clear to me what your own view of dialogue was, you know, whether you agreed that it was only a very remote metaphor that could be used. And maybe more interestingly, whether you think that the dialogue we have now is thicker 25, 30 years on than it was when Bruno wrote in the early noughties.
Yeah, I think, oh wait, I see Eve. Shall I take Eve Meny? Or were you a student at the Academy? No, I'm kidding. I'll just take the question from Eve Meny here, and then we'll go back to Marta.
No, go ahead. No, you don't have a question. Well, I have actually, hello. I have actually a a big problem, because you mentioned the crisis of the rule of law, but we could also mention the political crisis, which is going on throughout all democracies without exception. And I really wonder if the two are not intertwined. That is, we agree, I suppose, that any democracy is defined by its popular input, but also by its constitutionalism, by its constitutional component. If you consider democracies over the past, let's say, 50, 60 years, the popular input has remained more or less what it was. We have not been very innovative or inventive about democratic participation, involvement, etc. Instead, we have been extremely active on the front of constitutionalism, to such an extent that we could say every bit of our life is submitted, is dependent on the rule of law and on the control of constitutional courts. In the details, for instance, in France, the Council of State, during the COVID pandemic, could decide if it was possible to go to see a movie, no, or to go to mass, yes. I still wonder what's the difference going into a cinema or going into a church from the pandemic point of view. So every dimension of our life is regulated, which means that the space for politics has shrunk dramatically. And if we want to have a good example, you were all worried by the program of Mrs. Meloni when she came to power. And we have realized that after 6 months or 8 months, she has swallowed more or less everything. So what is the margin of maneuver of politics? And I wonder if the populist reactions that we observe everywhere is not a reaction to the incapacity of politics to make choices. It's nearly impossible today to make choices. If you add to that all the European treaties are de facto constitutionalized in their entirety, the space for political autonomous decisions is very limited. In addition, there is a creeping transformation of individual interest into fundamental rights. And you really wonder sometimes what is not a fundamental right, since any individual interest might become, without consideration that rights are limited by the rights of others, or that fundamental rights are also compensated by duties. Nobody speaks about duties. So I have a big problem, a big issue, because how to resolve the right balance between political autonomy and legal trapping. So I don't know if you have an answer to that.
Marta, I see one more question, so I think we'll take it down here at the back.
Thank you. Yes, my question builds a bit on the one by Professor Meny.
Your name?
Sorry? I'm Franka Faisal. I'm a participant of the Academy and a PhD student here at the UI. So I think what is important when we talk about the rule of law crisis, or what is often maybe a bit forgotten, is that, at least in my view, it's embedded in a broader crisis of democracy, one that is more structural across many democracies, one of political disenchantment certainly, and then in the countries also that you mentioned, the EU member states who are arguably the usual suspect in terms of the rule of law crisis. It is a concomitant undermining of also democratic institutions, key pillars of a democratic society, like shrinking of civil society space, undermining of media pluralism and all of these things. And precisely, therefore, I think that the answer to the rule of law crisis and the democracy crisis that goes hand in hand with it cannot be less democracy in a way, because also if you say we want to build a European democracy and European democracies based on common values, I think what we need is, of course, democracy itself and democratic processes to spell out what are those values, what do we mean, and find a democratic common understanding in order to have maybe a thicker constitutional base to also prevent future rule of law crisis, let's say. So I was wondering, in your case for enhancing European constitutionalism, do you see space for a more majoritarian constitutionalism, or a constitutionalism that is open to even innovative, more radical democratic methods?
I think we'll return to you, Marta, for some answers.
Yes. I see a common thread between your question, Gronia, Professor Meni's one, and Franca's one. I'm very sympathetic with what we've said. I mean, the main issue is rethinking democracy. I think that the crisis of the rule of law is an expression of a crisis of the democratic idea. It becomes populism and wants to get rid of all the constitutional courts and other legal constraints, rule of law and independent authority limits to the democratic power. But it is also the reaction of a trend in which we have shifted the balance that is always an unstable balance. That's the difficult point, between what shall be decided at the political level by democratic institution, elected institution, and the other side, that is those values that we want also to secure against the majority. I think that this is the difficult moment. You are right. I think that the time is to keep the two perspectives together. We have a lot of reflection on the rule of law crisis, a lot of scholarship on the crisis of democracy and the backlash of democracy into populism, but they are two expressions of the same problem. We have to find a solution together. That means finding a new balance, not getting rid of one or the other. Populists want to eliminate the side of the limits to the power of the majority. On the other side, you are right, Professor Meni, we cannot do only by means of judicial decision. Not everything is fundamental rights, not everything is a constitutional decision. We have to leave room for democratic decision, and also at the European level also. That's why I put together also the idea of pluralism, of different solutions in different member states. So I completely agree. Your questions rendered more clear what I had in mind. It is that the two big debates of this time of ours, the crisis of democracy and the crisis of the rule of law, are really the two sides of the same coin, and we have to put it together in order to find a common and balanced answer to this question. Bruno, your difficult question always. Small, but straight to the point. I think that your question brings us let's say, from a reflection on the causes of the present situation to a reflection on the remedies. What should we do in order to answer? And Poland is one of the tests that we have in front of us, because if in case there is a new government, they change their view, what shall we do? I've heard a number of proposals about that. I don't have any sure answer, but I have a clear principle in mind, and it is that you cannot imagine a remedy to the rule of law crisis by breaching the rule of law. I mean, you cannot go and say these judges that were appointed in a partisan manner shall be removed because they are simply doing wrong. You have to prove it and do it case by case and have a specific evidence showing that they have broken, I don't know, disciplinary rules or other kind of things. I don't think that we cannot say where they were on the wrong side of the history, and so we don't want to have judges in the court because simply they were the expression of the previous government. That would be exactly the same mistake, and we cannot repeat this circle that would be really, really, really dangerous for the sake of the institution itself. I don't know if an infringement procedure is the proper way to deal with it. The only strong point that I see in the infringement procedure, and I see it as, from my experience as in the political government, when we had an infringement procedure opened by the Commission, is that there is a long dialogue between the institution and the European Commission, trying to find a way, answer, replies, and so it is not, they do not go straight in front of the court. I don't know at what point is the procedure right now. I think it's at the very beginning, but at the very beginning you still have room for a number of adjustments, and I very much hope that this is the phase of the procedure in which they can find an answer with the contribution also of the national authorities, not only saying you are wrong, you have to change this one. And this brings me to Neil's questions. Yes, I strongly believe in dialogue, all form of dialogues, even the most difficult one. This was something that we have practiced in our constitutional court in the last years with a lot of benefit. When I entered in the constitutional court, there was also the precedent, the case law said the constitutional court is not a judge for the purposes of Article 2067, so we don't do for preliminary rulings. We reverted it in 2008 and 2013, and then we had wonderful experiences in some cases that, in my view, were very constructive in both for the European context and for the national ones. So, but also in other fields, all the reforms that we have put together in the field of criminal justice, for example, was even to imagine, restorative justice, imagine a dialogue between victims and perpetrators. So you take the risk. You don't know how the result is in dialogue, but it's always worth trying in all forms, both at the institutional level and in personal. This is my strong. If I believe in something, this is dialogue. So it's clear my position on that. And also to Paolo's question, when I say neutral court, I don't imagine a court standing aloof, far away from society. No, I think that neutral from partisanship, but very embedded in social life. And again, we, President Sciarra and myself, supported very much some reforms of the Italian Constitutional Court, for example, introducing Amici Curie, and it is a way of opening to the society, of having inputs, especially on difficult new questions, directly from the voice of the protagonist of society, NGOs, and all the rest, because I think that this is something that the court shall always have in mind. Also, the communication of the court. A court embedded in society, in my view, it's the reply and the correct reply to a court that become the branch of a partisan body. That is another thing, a different, two perspectives that you should not confuse among one another. Okay.
So we've kept perfect time, and we have another event starting in 15 minutes. So before we thank Marta and give applause for her speech and the questions, I just want to make one brief announcement, which is that after this, we'll take a brief break of 15 minutes, but I'm going to ask the De Witte family and also the members of the next panel to stay behind for a few minutes. There'll be some photographs, and then we can have a brief break before the next. But in the meantime, thank you so much to Marta, to all of you for an excellent speech.